I want to thank everyone, including our esteemed panelists, for joining us for this critical discussion on bridging the vaccine divide. Over the past 2 years, COVID-19 has ravaged health systems and economies in countries across the world. Many argue that a pandemic of respiratory disease was predictable, but the devastation and the insufficiencies across the globe came as a surprise to all of us working in the space of public health. It laid bare the uneven distribution of health, social, economic risks within and between countries. 9 months into the pandemic, science came to the rescue, but we saw differential distribution of vaccines, therapeutics, access to hospitalization, leaving untold millions of people vulnerable to the virus. Let's take vaccines as an example. Today, 65% of the world has received at least one dose, and only around 15 to 16% of people in low-income countries have received that much. Several countries have already started distributing booster doses and planning for regular COVID-19 vaccination schedules, demonstrating how parts of the world are moving from pandemic to an endemic situation. However, others across countries continue to confront challenges to fully vaccinate their population. There are also innovative technology transfer deals that are attempting to make new antivirals for COVID-19 available in poor countries at affordable prices. But are we looking at history repeating itself? Can we really afford to now, with inequities on vaccine distribution, inequities for antivirals? So that's the big question. The pandemic has also underscored something that those of us who work in public health have been saying for a very long time, that there are interlinked relationships between health, social structures, and the economy. This realization and this recognition now opens a window of opportunity to act on decades of global commitments to prioritize health equity. Choices to act or not to act are either likely to further entrench these inequities or dramatically reduce them. And that really depends on all of us. I read a wonderful line which says, equity-centered planning, decision-making, and action that builds on the learnings given to us by the pandemic will help us move to a more hopeful, just, and humane collective future. And that just stuck with me. And I think this is the perfect opportunity. Today, we want to focus on the critical issue of access. How can we ensure that these innovations reach everyone when they need them the most? And while we reflect on the challenges, we need to focus on the learnings and the way forward so that we can work in solidarity. We don't have to work in isolation. Today, I'm really honored to moderate this very, very important discussion with a great panel. And with this, I'd like to invite the panel. I would first like to request Dr. Vinod Paul, who's a member of Niti Aayog, where he leads the Health, Nutrition, and Human Resource Development verticals. He's part of the Union government's core team for COVID-19 pandemic response, and we look forward to hearing his thoughts on India's achievements in managing the pandemic and the learnings that can be shared with the world. I've known Dr. Paul for years, and even then, I forget, 12 or 13 years ago when we met, he was very passionate about equitable distribution. Dr. Ayode Alakija, sorry, Yodi. She's the chair, African Union Vaccine Alliance, and Special Envoy for ACT Accelerator. She's a global health leader and activist who's deployed diplomacy to bring together the global North and South in coordinated responses to the pandemic. We're delighted to have you share insights on the ACT Accelerator and other key initiatives for advocating for equity. Joan Benson, who's the Executive Director, Public Health Partnerships, Global Vaccines, Public Policy, Merck US. She leads strategic engagement with global public health organizations involved in vaccine policies, immunization immunization programs, and funding for vaccines internationally, including WHO, Gavi, UNICEF, and the Gates Foundation. Joan, we look forward to your insights, drawing from your extensive experience in different geographies across the globe. Mr. Jaisal Doshi is the Deputy CEO, B Medical Systems, a global cold chain and medical refrigeration device manufacturer. At B Medical Systems, he's driving innovation and building strong partnerships, contributing to his company's ability to store and transport any vaccine at any temperature in the world. He brings an integral perspective on the infrastructural needs to bridge the vaccine divide. Jean-Pierre is the founder of Novonda, a consulting and training firm that brings real-world expertise to organization and leadership teams with a focus on health, gender, and economic equity. Prior to this, he was the global head of advocacy and communications at Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, where he was instrumental in launching the International Finance Facility for Immunization, as well as the Advanced Market Commitment for Pneumonia Vaccine. So we really wait to hear from this wealth of experience. So, Dr. Paul, the first question is really for you. And as I mentioned earlier, you're passionate about equity, and your focus has always been making the tools available. And I've seen the passion with which you advocated for rotavirus and for pneumococcal vaccines for children. What do you think were the key learnings as you started working on the pandemic?
Thank you, Anjali. Distinguished colleagues, very warm welcome to India on behalf of Niti Aayog, which is the apex policy think tank of the Government of India. Very pleased to welcome you, and thank you for this opportunity. Well, personal aspirations apart, I like to say that the notion of equity in the context of the pandemic truly and effectively and most sincerely emanates from our leadership. The Honorable Prime Minister, in the course of this journey, when the nation started to move toward finding technological solutions, including vaccines in particular, gave a very clear direction and philosophy. And he said that this endeavor is not only for India, but for the world. That's how the journey started. Imagine, we didn't know we will succeed in creating vaccines. We didn't know when we will be able to achieve this. But the direction was very clear. And he articulated not only in the limited conversations, but also from the podium of the UN General Assembly. Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam was the mantra that he referred to, which is world is one family. That is there in our scriptures. So from very beginning, manavata ke liye, for the world, for humanity. So this philosophy underlined our endeavor. Whatever public goods India was able to produce was seen through this filter always. And I would say that journey and that endeavor continues. And in my previous life, as Anjali has mentioned, yes, indeed, personally too, very, very committed to equity. We have worked in that direction to find affordable technologies, medical products and solutions and so on. But I'm a small part in this larger initiative. But truly to say that India stood on that principle, and we continue to stand on that principle, and we'll elaborate this as we move on. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Yudi, universal access to life-saving vaccines, drugs, and therapeutics can be viewed as human right. And you've been at the forefront of talking about equitable access and fighting for it, talking about equitable vaccines right since the beginning of the pandemic. What are some of the key challenges that you see have been in ensuring access, and why is that? Why is there imbalance?
Well, thank you so much, and it is just such a pleasure and honor to be here. It's wonderful to meet Dr. Paul in person. As he said, we've been seeing each other on ACT Accelerator Zoom calls, and so honored to be here with so many colleagues here in India. I want to start off by stating that we as a global community in this pandemic failed. We failed the world. We failed the high-income countries. We failed the low-income countries. Dr. Paul said very rightly earlier on that India and Prime Minister Modi, who we were just honored to be at the opening session with, started off the pandemic with the AstraZeneca vaccine, talking about vaccines as a public good. Vaccine Maitri, I remember very well, the excitement in those early days, the vaccine friendship, for those who don't know. Vaccine Maitri saved Fiji, which is my other home, when the Delta variant hit about a year and a half ago, and the first real doses of vaccines that Fiji got were the 100,000 doses that were sent urgently from India. COVAX, the facility which is the and I will explain a little bit about the ACT Accelerator, because I believe it's somewhat of a mystery to many people. You know, what is this thing? I've been introduced as co-chair of the ACT Accelerator and special envoy to WHO, but also I co-chair the Africa Union Vaccine Delivery Alliance. But COVAX, which is the vaccine pillar of the ACT Accelerator, and interesting, I did not know that you used to be with Gavi, but explains why you look familiar. COVAX, I'm coming for you. So COVAX delivered in those days 12,000 doses of vaccine to Fiji. 12,000. It was a tiny little box. And it was that spirit of cooperation from a country, from India at that time, that saved those islands, and then Australia then went on to provide vaccines, which will take us on to our next topic I won't get into now, which is regional and local manufacturing. So what have the lessons learned been? Let me talk first of all about what the ACT Accelerator is, which I was just talking to President von der Leyen's team, who asked me that as co-chair, what is my view of the ACT Accelerator? And what I said to them, that it is flawed, but it is all that we have. It is the only global multilateral partnership that we have at the moment. And what the ACT Accelerator is, it's a conglomeration. I'm sorry, I haven't eaten, I can't speak. So it's a corporation, it's a partnership of what I call the big boys, because sadly they are all boys, and I will say that as well. I'm very much an advocate for gender, so I call them all my brothers. But the 9 principles that I chair every Thursday, co-chair together with Carl Bildt, the former Prime Minister of Sweden, who is also here today, he's my co-chair, are the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the WHO, Gavi, CEPI, Global Fund, and Unitaid, Wellcome Trust. I mean, these are the big names, this is at CEO level. And the level of commitment is such that we all meet every Thursday for about 3 hours. So that is what the ACT Accelerator is. The ACT Accelerator is not a thing of the WHO. People think it is the WHO. No, it is not. There is a secretariat at the WHO. I do not work for the WHO. Neither does Carl Bildt, of course. You know, we serve as global diplomats to help bring this alliance together. But what we did was we moved too slowly. We dealt with what was a humanitarian crisis and an emergency as though we were dealing with a development problem. We failed to cooperate as we should have done. We failed to have the spirit of Vaccine Maitri right at the very beginning. And there are those who will tell you that COVAX, I mean, I was the most ardent critic of COVAX at the very beginning, and continue. I mean, I speak with Seth Berkley now almost every other day, and you know, Seth is now, as I say, I call them all my brothers because I'm the only girl. So any of you who are out there who want to become global health leaders, who are women, please step up to the plate, because we need you all. You know, we were not inclusive enough. There's a saying in my language, which is Yoruba, Akifa orile olori, you do not shave my head in my absence. We decided for the low-income countries of the world what they wanted without having those from the low-income countries at the table. Even now, today, at the ACT Accelerator, I am effectively the only low-income representative. Of course, my country is Nigeria and I live in Abuja. Dr. Tedros represents WHO, but he is a global figure. So that voice was not there from the very beginning. And that, for me, I would say that as we go on and as we prepare for the next thing, because there is going to be a next thing, we must be sure to be more inclusive and to be more urgent in our deliberation and to be more politically astute and policy-led. This was not a health problem. This was a geopolitical crisis. It was an education crisis. It was a gender crisis. It was a socio-economic crisis. But just like HIV/AIDS, we did not learn those lessons, and we treated it like a health issue, which it was not. So that, I would say, would be my opening remarks.
Thank you so much. And, Dr. Paul, I am going to come back to you because I think she made a very important point that, yes, we are going to see another pandemic. And I think some of the learnings that you can share will be very important. But Jaisal, new medical innovations have been essential to responding to the pandemic. For mRNA vaccines such as the Pfizer's and Moderna's to monoclonal antibodies and new therapeutics, the infrastructure, the health infrastructure also needs to change. In your view, as we look at ensuring access, in reality rather than just in words, and strengthen last mile delivery and build back better, what kind of innovations do you think infrastructures will need?
Thanks a lot, Anjali. A pleasure to be here. And I think the amount of innovation that has happened in the pharmaceutical world is something that will change the next few decades. I think when you talk about mRNA, when you talk about monoclonal bodies and so on, there is just, I think we've accelerated innovation and R&D especially by decades. So I think that is one of the silver linings of the pandemic, if I can say so. Coming back to your question, one of the big things that a lot of people do not realize, and this is quite common now, is it's not a vaccine that saves lives, but it's vaccination that saves lives.
Yes.
And there is a big difference between getting a vaccine, but actually administering it into the arm of a person who needs it. And there you're talking about an extremely efficient delivery system, which frankly did not exist in most parts of the world. And I think that has been one of the other big learnings of the pandemic. Getting a vaccine into the arm of each and every person who needs it is a huge, arduous task. And I think fundamentally we've underestimated that. If you look at, for example, the DRC, the percentage of people who've got a single dose in the DRC today stands at 0.8%. And one of the fundamental challenges is the inability to have efficient delivery mechanisms such as a cold chain. And here I would again like to commend about India's example. I think what Dr. Paul mentioned, we as a company are based in Luxembourg. And this is a great example of also fantastic bilateralism as well as multilateralism. So as a company from Luxembourg, we were invited by the Prime Minister, who reached out to the Prime Minister of Luxembourg and said, look, you have a company which focuses on cold chain. I would like them to help India, but not just help, but make in India. And I think this is again an example of regional manufacturing, local manufacturing. And this will astound everyone. We were able to set up manufacturing in a country like India in 4 months. And this is during the critical part of the pandemic. So I think, again, this just shows a country like India has done a fantastic job. And I must congratulate and laud the government of India and the Prime Minister for the vision. And the last point I just wanted to make is there's a lot of innovative technology like ultra cold temperatures. And again, there is a lot of investment being made in this. The ACT Accelerator is a strong proponent of this, investing in health systems and strengthening health systems. And I believe that this is the way to go.
Thank you so much. Joan, let me come to you. The pursuit of health equity is really global health's raison d'etre. I mean, that's what we aim to be. However, we've seen with the pandemic, the imbalances in access. And I know you've had years of experience. And can you just outline in which other areas have we seen similar inequities? Because we have to do better. And that's one thing the pandemic has shown, and we must do better. So any other area without the pandemic as well?
Thank you, Anjali. And first of all, thank you for the invitation to be here. Let me say that this is the first time that I've actually been out since the pandemic. So it's been 2.5 years of being behind a screen. So excuse me if I misbehave up here with my, just forgive me if I misbehave up here with my remarks. I came here with 20 pages I was going to read to you, but, I'm sure you wouldn't appreciate that. So I'll just stick with a few remarks. As I listened to, the other speakers, I think you pretty much just summed up what I would have said. There were some key words that emerged. You talked about leadership, Vijay. You mentioned urgency, acting with a sense of urgency. And when I look at those two things and I think about it's not a pandemic. People don't think of it as a pandemic. I see it as an epidemic. But if you look in the area of cervical cancer, which is a very high burden in developing countries, low and low middle income countries, and yet the world has not paid attention. As a physician, as a woman, as a mother, it just scares me to think that we have a disease here that is preventable through vaccination, is preventable with screening, with early detection and treatment, and yet the world has largely been silent. I know that the WHO did, implement a strategy against the elimination of cervical cancer, and it is my hope and desire and wish that the world actually pays attention. And so when you think about inequity, that is another area, Anjali, where there has been gross inequity. Inequity, and I would say it maybe in terms of leadership, in terms of political will and commitment. But it's not only because countries just don't want to do it. It's because when they look at the vast array of other health diseases and priorities that they need to address, it just becomes one more. But as we think about, whether it's routine childhood immunizations, even, COVID vaccines, and we think about vaccines across the lifespan from childhood through adulthood, and now including, HPV vaccination against cervical cancer. In Anjali's words, we've got to do better. There's got to be stronger political will and commitment to help address these issues and make it a priority so that we don't save the woman from childbirth. A lot of focus on, maternal mortality, and not against maternal mortality. It's important to address those things, but it's the same woman, for crying out loud. So we spend all of those resources addressing, maternal mortality, and then we lose the woman, to cervical cancer, especially for something that is highly preventable. On the other front, when you talked about urgency, this is an area where I don't think that we're acting with a sense of urgency. And I'm appealing to the global health, development agencies and just global health agencies in general, because they set, to a large extent, they set the priorities. And so when the global health, agenda is set in that respect and says, these are the priorities for the countries, that's what they're going to follow. So I hope there will be a fine balance. There will be a balance between country prioritization, global health agenda, and at the center of it all, the woman, the life of the woman. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan. Those are very, very powerful words. Jean-Pierre, we just mentioned you worked at Gavi, and I know you're just going to talk to you about that. And you were behind the advanced market commitment, as well as the international financing facility. I'd like to ask you the reverse question. What do you think in the world of public health has worked well? And do you think we've learned from the COVID-19 pandemic to make sure that those experiences that have worked well could be used now and for the future?
Well, thank you, Anjali. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for hosting us. Things that have worked well. You're putting me on a tough spot here. Definitely initiatives like Gavi have delivered. As of, I think, last month, almost 900 million children, extra children, had been vaccinated thanks to Gavi and the partners. About 14 million deaths had been prevented through immunization. So that's definitely worked very well. Another thing that has worked well is financial models being used to fund development activities. You mentioned the International Finance Facility for Immunization. At the time when Gavi launched the IFIM, we raised $4.2 billion that went to Gavi for the purchase of vaccines. AMCs raised $1.2 billion when they were created as well. So it's given the development community, it's given the partners new ways to think about funding health and development activities. And today what we see is a lot of the discussions on how to use special drawing rights. How are we going to make sure that the funding coming from the IMF reaches the countries that need that funding, and how we bridge the equity there. Just to give you an example, Africa as a continent has about $30 billion of SDR, special drawing rights. A country like France alone has 27 billion. And even if President Macron, who was newly re-elected, announced that France would target a large percentage of those SDR to the African continent, we must do more. But definitely use financial mechanisms very smartly with the regional partners, and that is very important, the African Development Bank, for example, or the other development banks, to make sure that that money is targeted where it needs to be.
Thank you. Thank you, Jean-Pierre. And I think, when you talk about success, one of the things that really comes to mind is that, when COVID vaccines were available, the big question was, how is India going to get the vaccines out to so many people? And I would really love to hear, and also, what are the learnings that India can share? And if I can push you a little more, the important role when we talk about learnings, the important role India can play in South-South collaborations.
Thank you, Anjali. Let me pick up threads from what I heard
please.
from IOD. For India to be able to contribute to other nations is also reflected from the fact that almost 100 countries received Indian vaccines. And we started our vaccination program on 16th of January 2021. And the first consignment received in another country was on the 20th of January. Which other country would offer vaccine, had offered vaccine in almost simultaneously as to our own nationals to another country and several other countries? Again, the fact remains that this was also applicable to drugs, medicines. Again, more than 100 countries received Indian medicines at that point in time, and other technologies. It shows our capacity, it shows our capabilities, and it also shows our will to share the public goods with the world. Currently, India has for COVID vaccine a capacity to the tune of 4 billion doses per annum. I like us to know this. It's contextual. I'll come to the lessons in just in a moment. So 4 billion or perhaps even more. We also have on the anvil an mRNA vaccine which is thermostable in refrigeration, normal cold chill condition. We possibly will have an intranasal vaccine which can just speed up the vaccine to vaccination across populations. And we also, of course, already have a protein subunit vaccine, again at an affordable cost, which is a very important part, affordable cost, not $25 a dose, or $35 or $45, under $3 or even less than that potentially. So just I like the community, world community to know that a bouquet of options are there, much more than what we had last year. Going forward, for whatever strategy, vaccination strategy would be required for the world, there are things that India would offer. Also, picking up on the issue of vaccines to vaccination, very humbly, I would state that public goods such as our IT platform is available, cold chain SOPs, delivery on the ground, capacity. We have offered this through the ACT Accelerator to other nations. Please connect with us. This, you have seen how seamlessly our vaccination program has reached, 1.9 billion people approximately already. And therefore these goods, which are so critical when you have the vaccine but they don't reach the beneficiary, we can bridge that in a humble south to south collaboration. What are the lessons? How did India pan this out? Above all, a very early decision and a clear direction to deliver on this by the Prime Minister. Clear direction. And he created convening mechanisms for it across the government, whole of government convening mechanism, task force, empowered group, in a very systematic way. We worked both with academia to be helpful, and we have a full-fledged vaccine emanating from our academia through the Indian Council of Medical Research, the COVAX that picked up by the Indian industry, but simultaneously working with the industry houses, industry units to offer. The lesson was a clear policy direction, enabling regulatory systems, persuading, talking almost on a daily basis in the critical phase of this evolution when we did not know when the vaccines would come, helping with clinical trials to the tune of 28,000, 25,000 subjects across the country in a speedy manner, facilitation in terms of advance commitment that was made to, in a certain way, in big amount to a particular entity, as you are well aware, and above all, a dialogue all the time. It was a great handhold, seamless connect. You talk to the best people to talk about this are actually the industry. But I'll tell you that we were engaged on a daily basis, connected, clear-cut directions, reaching out with feedback to the Honorable Prime Minister. He went to these units, did multiple VCs with them and so on. So the lesson here is that when we as a nation, we as a system work in the mission mode seamlessly, the delivery happens. In 9 months or around about that time, we had multiple vaccines and more to come. The lesson for us is, you asked the first question, where will the vaccines come from? The lesson for us is, for such a big nation, actually there is no choice except to develop your own. Imagine if we were to be dependent for vaccinating 1 billion plus people from vaccines to be borrowed from where were these vaccines? I mean, I shudder to think, I get goosebumps, the course of all this. Fortunately, the vaccines were successful, as happened in most vaccines, nothing special in that sense. But there was simply no way out than to be self-dependent. Made in India, Atmanirbhar, self-reliance. This underpinning, I think, was the biggest force that we have to deliver on our own. We had the confidence because we had base, a profound, stable, resilient base of industry in our own nation. I also want to highlight, just the last bit on this, the role played by our SNTs, science and technology organizations. Please, any of the vaccines, including the AstraZeneca, several things were done, and much more for the other vaccines, by our national laboratories. The assays, the monkey virus challenge studies, which, very dangerous studies were done in the National Institute of Virology. We are conducting assays in the THSTI DBT laboratory for practically all the vaccines that are there on the. So huge contribution of our laboratories, and to service this, almost 1,000 crore equity. Sorry, not equity. Sorry, the fund, COVID Suraksha fund was created. The budget was created, and we handed out money, actual money, for research and development to companies after companies, 100 crore to this, 125 crore to another one, 100 crore to another one, and so on and so forth, and help them develop capacity. Also multiple fronts, and this helped us. It has lessons for future, and we want two things. One, that going forward, we even in this situation, as you know, on discussions in the ACT Accelerator, that inequity is still not over. So India is willing, Indian companies are willing, India Science and Enterprise is willing to collaborate with other nations to develop vaccines jointly on your soil or in an agreed way on our soil, when even in the extreme circumstances, there is a part to which we have committed, which will belong to another. This is the model which industry has offered. Government is willing to explore this in a systematic way, as also offshore production capacities, and I know that at least 5 nations have requested India to think about it, and we are working on those options. Just one last part on cervical cancer. Thank you for pointing that out. I do agree, it's very close to my heart. It has no business to be there in India. Cancer cervix is 45,000 odd, 42,000 odd deaths every year for India, and so much of misery of the poor people. It is the cancer of the poor, not acceptable. And we would work in a mission mode. The 2 solutions, HPV vaccine from India is likely to be licensed in a matter of a couple of months, if not a few weeks. It's on the anvil, the serum HPV vaccine, you're aware. And the point of care diagnostic, at least 3 very promising diagnostics are on the anvil, working systematically. One of them is based on RT-PCR, the other 2 are some other principles which are actual point of care. You see, the classical pap smear business doesn't work. Acetic acid doesn't work. So we're looking forward to getting these 2 technologies available, and once they are available for the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's just a lot of information. One of the things I related that you also said is that, yes, countries from the South have to be self-dependent. We have to invest in R&D. We have to make things happen. Would you like to elaborate a little bit on that? And also, I think it's important to talk about quality. How do we get the quality products into a country independent of where they are made? So I think if you can speak a little bit about that.
Absolutely. I think South-to-South cooperation is critical. I could not agree more. I mean, when this invitation came, one of the reasons why I wanted to come here was that I think that it's really important that we begin to talk to each other more, that we begin to have that handshake. For those of you who are old enough to remember the internet connecting and the handshaking between the modem and whatever it is, I'm totally giving away my age now. But that South-to-South cooperation is absolutely critical. India has done an incredible job in this pandemic. There is no doubt about it. And as you say, almost really a pharmacy to the world. But what happened was that COVID surprised us. This virus, SARS-CoV-2, surprised us all. And when the Delta variant came, I think the blip in what went on at that point was the fact that India suspended exports quite rightly, because of course people were dying, and those images of those funeral pyres burning across this land that still are seared into my sort of mind till this day. But what that did was it created a panic around the world, because you had become the pharmacy to the world, and that total and complete shutdown of exports created a fear and created, in some ways, it spurred on Africa and other parts of the world to say, wow, we now need to make our own. We need to make our own, because India is no longer exporting. I mean, it was not a permanent thing, but because we're in a pandemic, that word urgency, the fact is everyone keeps talking about development partners. And I think my one of the to the world through all of this is that we have keep dealing with this like it's a development problem. We keep dealing with this as though people are not dying still before our very eyes. I just told Anjali and some of the other colleagues that I have a friend, a 47-year-old, who's just been on a ventilator, triple vaccinated in London over the last few days. So for those of us who are triple vaccinated and are walking around without masks, this thing is not over. We don't know what's going on. And I think what Dr. Paul talked about high-level policy, I think the things that you got right, absolutely, nobody can argue with that, was the policy, the budget, the funding. I think one of the things that we said from the very beginning, Africa is 1.3 billion people to India's 1.4 billion. At that time, before I became co-chair of the ACT Accelerator, I was charged with being the co-chair of the Africa Vaccine Delivery Alliance for those 1.3 billion people. I would take a little bit of issue with what you said about DRC and the inability to deliver, because I think that is a narrative that we have going around the world that Africa cannot deliver. That is not true. That is not true. DRC is delivering Ebola vaccines at sub-zero temperature. My sister will be able to tell you exactly what those temperatures are. But DRC is delivering Ebola vaccines. There's just been an outbreak in the last 2 days. And thanks to those vaccinations, we are not as frightened, even though we've lost 2 weeks in that current outbreak in DRC. So that narrative, I want to quash that narrative that Africa cannot deliver vaccines, that Africa does not have capacity. What Africa lacks, and I'm not ashamed to say this, what Africa lacks is the concerted political will. What Africa lacks is the proper leadership to drive these things. What Africa lacks is a function, the focus of our resources in the right place. Look at what India has done. Look at what India has been able to do, the almost billion people that have been vaccinated in this land. So South to South cooperation is the thing, and we need to begin to talk not just to the West, and you know, we're also in a geopolitical muddle right now. There's geopolitical shifting sands. You know, even this week that we're here, even this conference, the level of interest from different parts of the world has to do with the fact that, as I said at the beginning, COVID is a geopolitical crisis. And everybody needs to wake up and understand and begin to answer, as we say, where we come from, answer their own father's name. Which means you need to become self-sufficient. You need to become self-reliant. You need to manufacture. And it is not just vaccines. All the tools. India also is producing diagnostics. We're also looking at these new oral antiviral pills. I will stop there.
Thank you. I'm going to change tacks a little bit. And I really would like you to share experiences where you've changed, let's say, the infrastructure, the cold chain infrastructure in certain countries across the African continent, and some of the things that you plan to do in India. And I would really like, post that very quickly, for Jean-Pierre and Joan to talk about, you know, what are the learnings? How can we make sure now these antivirals that are being developed that are delivered across equitably? So very quickly, we're going to, Shub is going to walk in any minute, and we've got 10 minutes, so 3 minutes each, please.
Sure. So maybe just before I respond to that, I'd like to respond to Ayurveda. And I think perhaps what I said did not come out entirely correctly, because I do not believe it is Africa which does not want it. But I think, and here I will critique the COVAX model a bit, because COVAX essentially is donors wanting to donate something which they need more than anybody themselves first. So what that has led to is Africa for decades has depended on Gavi, for example, which is essentially donor money, but for commodities that they did not need. For example, you do not need a polio vaccine in the US. And so there were countries very happily willing to donate it. With the COVID vaccine, that has not happened. And I think that is a fundamental disconnect, which has led, unfortunately, to this situation. Coming to your question, and I think there's a lot of positive stories as well. And going back to what Ayode said, it is countries demonstrating political will. It is countries saying, look, I do not care, or I do not want to depend on what a Gavi or a COVAX or an ACT-A for that matter is going to give me. But I will go out and ensure that I can buy vaccines and I can distribute them throughout the country. And here we are talking, when you talk about Pfizer, for example, at ultra cold -80 degrees Celsius, we have delivered the Pfizer vaccine to countries like South Sudan, to Syria, to Nigeria, Chad, Sierra Leone. I mean, you name it, and these countries have had access to the latest technology. So I think there is a lot of positive stories out there as well. And it's also going back to another theme, South-South cooperation. You know, countries are realizing that they need to step up for their own and not depend just on donor money or the global north.
Thank you. Jean-Pierre, Joan, will you go first?
Okay. You were talking about the Ebola crisis. I think it's taught the health community how to function in very low temperature environments. And DRC led the way, sadly for the wrong reasons, but brought much needed know-how to the world in terms of managing and distributing vaccines in those types of conditions. So there's a South-South cooperation, of course, but also a South-North cooperation, which should take place as well. And as we speak about some of the things that worked well, the pandemic has made us realize that continents like the African continent need to take their destiny into their own hands. And they need to do this in a strategic way. And we see that happening more and more with the creation of the African Medicine Agency, which is going to set the standards for vaccines. We see the Africa CDC and the work the CDC, the incredible work that the CDC has done during the pandemic, and sharing all these best practices across the continent, across the country. We need to focus on the things that work well. Of course, there's still many issues to be fixed. The shift from vaccines to vaccination is a very important one.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre. And Yode, Africa's issue is indeed leadership, and that is a whole other session, so we wouldn't get into that, but let's talk offline. I told you I would misbehave, right? But forgive me. So to answer the question that Anjali asked me about the availability and access to antiviral therapies, MSD is the manufacturer of our molnupiravir, which is our antiviral against, COVID-19. And we have been working, again, I come back to the word sense of urgency, and we've been working with a sense of urgency to ensure access to this antiviral therapy. In particular, and I'm going to look at the numbers here, that we've shipped molnupiravir to over 20 countries, including 3.1 million patient courses that were shipped to the US government, and obviously several other countries and counting. We've also entered into advanced purchase and supply agreements of this product with governments for over 30 countries worldwide. We signed voluntary licensing agreements with the medicine patent pool, as well as with generic manufacturers, including in India as well. And these manufacturers are selected based upon, their decision to actually pre-qualify the product and obviously their experience with supply. We're also allocating up to 30 million courses for distribution through UNICEF and the ACT Accelerator in the first half of 2022. And with all of this, we are on track to make available, I believe, up to 20 million courses in 2022. So while the generic manufacturers are wrapping up their manufacturing supply, we are committed to working with the UNICEF and ACT Accelerator to ensure access to this much needed antiviral therapies. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to open it up for 2 questions and then a final couple of words, Dr. Paul, from you. So 2 questions if anyone has. Otherwise, I'm going to just request. Looks like, yes, we've got to. Yes, please give your, please state your name, and got a gentleman right behind you. Yeah.
My name is Melissa Conley-Tyler. So, Melissa Conley-Tyler, I'm from the Asia Pacific Development Diplomacy and Defence Organisation, and we're actually part of the Australian Council for International Development, so we're all about putting development at the heart of foreign policy. I've really been listening and mulling over what it means for a country like Australia. We've been working very hard on a campaign called End COVID for All, the idea being to explain to the Australian population who don't think much about the conditions of other countries in the world because they're self-centred, like most countries are, that if they want to have a normal life, post-COVID life, then they actually have to care about all of the countries in our region and that we should be manufacturing and assisting. But I'm interested because what I'm hearing sounds like that's not as welcomed, that perhaps there should be other messages. But what's your view? What should a country like Australia be doing?
First of all, I have to say that Australia saved the islands of the Pacific. So Australia absolutely should be manufacturing. The after vaccine mitrate was the 30,000, 40,000 doses that would come across on a plane to Fiji. Many people don't realize Fiji had the highest death rate in the world, higher than India, during the Delta wave. So absolutely, it's not that it's not welcome. It's not either or. It's both and. I think we all need to be doing what we can, and Australia does have its own unique role to play in that in that region, but in the world geopolitically. I think we all have to do what we can. But the other thing that Australia can do is support the efforts of countries within the region, if be it Fiji or Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea is one of the countries that has the worst vaccination rates in the world, actually, at the moment. And I'm thinking about taking a trip there in the next few weeks to go and see what we can do. So maybe we'll come and talk to you about it. But those sort of efforts are really needed.
I guess it's allowed to take this off for speakers. I'm a temporary speaker. I'm Sean Bisharp, UN Resident Coordinator here in India, and have had the pleasure, of course, to work with Dr. Paul through our partnership with Niti Aayog. But I just wanted to say sort of a comment and a question. First comment is that I think, I've had the opportunity in my first 5 months here to travel a lot around the country, and have been really impressed. We're talking about South-South cooperation or South-North or whatnot, and I think I've seen India has a tremendous amount of lessons to share with other countries across the range of the high-tech, the low-tech, you name it, certainly in the pharmaceutical. I'm just coming back from Gujarat, which is the biggest pharmacy industry of the pharmacy of the world, and there we even just launched WHO launched a global center on traditional medicines, how to bring traditional medicines more through the kind of scientific process to avail in building resilience and immunities and such. But for example, communities here, you see this amazing connection between the vaccines produced locally between the digital platform, EVIN and COVIN platform, that was absolutely critical to scale up fast, effective delivery from the point of communicating with the beneficiary, the end user, the supply chain, the logistics, resupply, all of that. And it's incredible. You go to small clinics in small towns and see how this has all worked so well. And then also the frontline workers. You have the Anganwadis, you've got these Kurumbashu, you've got all of these community-based, quite often women-led outreach, and that's the last mile, and that's the critical point. Going out to poor communities and saying, hey, you're scheduled to get vaccinated now, or looking at the routine immunizations. Your baby needs to get vaccinated, and keeping that critically important routine immunization and public health system working during this pandemic. And I guess that's sort of one concern I have, is that, are we able to use the lessons and apply from COVID to this panoply of other, HPV was mentioned, because, I think at the end of once we start really holistically counting up all the cost benefit of things, we're going to see there's been an enormous cost to shutdowns of health systems, this sort of thing that we haven't yet calculated. So just to say, I think India really has a story to tell in that comprehensive response. That's not actually the question. The question is, what about intellectual property rights? I haven't heard, and learning from TRIPS and HIV and ARVs and such. What's the view of the panel on that?
I think we need an entire discussion on that alone, but I am going to just leave it to, any two of the panelists who are going to respond to this. 2 is my favorite number, and then before Shub comes in here, we must close. So, anyone? Jean-Pierre?
Well, and you had Ursula von der Leyen here early on speaking. President Macron has suggested that we should relax the rules for sharing IP. Europe, as a continent, hasn't come to an agreement on this, but it's definitely something that will make a difference.
I am going to, I cannot leave this just to industry or to those who are in private sector, sorry. So I'm going to have to say that the TRIPS waiver that India and South Africa called for is absolutely desperately needed. The moment to do it is now. The moment to do it is in this pandemic. There's a compromise that has been reached, a compromise agreement. There are those who are the purists who say that this compromise should not be accepted. And whilst I am not an intellectual property lawyer, I do also recognize that those people who are in the business of negotiating, bodies that are consensus bodies like WTO and others, can be negotiating for the next 20 years and nothing will change. If we don't grab the opportunity of what we have right now and take it and use it, we may never get anything. That is my personal view. I have interrogated the matter deeply. There are those who are sort of activists like me and what have you who say, no, we must not accept this deal. But I think that as I screamed for joy as President Macron was re-elected yesterday, because God help us for the potential alternative, I have to say that we all must recognize that this pandemic has provided an opportunity. There is an opportunity within this crisis, and that it is no time for business as usual. And what people are trying to do around the negotiating table is business as usual. The Ukraine-Russia crisis has created a problem now where even those negotiating bodies that include Russia, G20 and others, are being rendered inoperable because people are walking out when Russia walks into the room. So how are we going to move forward? This is a critical moment in global history. I penned an op-ed which I will be published tomorrow, talking about the lessons and what India has taught the world, and that India has really shown the model of how to go in this pandemic. And I want to reiterate that, but I want to also reiterate to you, Dr. Paul, and to the leadership here, to please support what you can in pushing forward these intellectual property rights. Even if we don't get full trips, let us get what we can when the world is being forced to give it to us. Thank you.
Any last comments from anyone?
Yes, and just like your day, I couldn't just leave us and be quiet. Yeah, first of all, let me applaud the government of India for all of the work that they have done and what you have accomplished in this pandemic. As far as the TRIPS waiver is concerned, to directly answer your question, one of the things that I'm not intending to speak on behalf of all of industry. I'm speaking, in my own recognition as an MSD employee. We've done a lot to ensure, access, including things that I just mentioned a few minutes ago in terms of voluntary licenses to the medicine patent pool, to generic manufacturers. And I'll be very clear that we do not support the TRIPS waiver. We believe that a lot of work has gone into negotiations with existing trade agreements that have been working very well. And, it helps strike a good balance between the need to act now, where there is a medical need, and also ensuring that one is upholding, the rights to innovation and all of the commitments that have gone towards, innovation. So in that respect, we do not support a TRIPS waiver. We believe that there is a whole lot that is, that needs to be done, and these kinds of conversations just detract from what really needs to be addressed. There's a whole lot more that needs to be addressed in terms of ensuring, equitable access, whether you're looking at, raw materials and ensuring that the raw materials are reaching where they need to reach, and a whole lot of other infrastructural issues that are also prevalent that are just being sidetracked. And so, as Anjali said, that's going to be a whole day's discussion. So I'm going to just pause here and just...
Yes, that is going to be a whole day's discussion, and I'm going to stop here with a request. I think we really need to work towards setting up a learning platform, and that is the need of the hour, which addresses a lot of the issues that have been raised. And with that, thank you so much for being so patient. I wish I could have opened it up to a whole lot of questions, but the panelists will definitely mingle, and you can ask them whatever you want. Thank you so much for this.